It's Alan Sides.
Hey, Mike, good to see you.
Great to see you. Mike Nehra from Vintage King and Alan Sides with all kinds of history. So we're going to have a little fun talking to Alan about, he's in town, bringing his new speakers in town with Rick Plushner and to work with VK. And they took a tour of the tech shop and so on. And
it's amazing. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anything this together. And have this many areas and this many venues to do every imaginable microphone. It's impressive, Mike, I have to say.
Thanks, Alan. And I the funny thing is, I was thinking to myself last night, I was going to bed, and I was like, we're going to interview Alan Sides today. I'm thinking, it just all rushed back to me. In 1990, I worked at Ocean Way Hollywood with a band for a couple months, a major label thing. And we worked in the gray, what I call the Van Halen room. We had 8078.
Right.
And we worked also in the linoleum floored, tall ceilinged, cream colored API room.
Of course, yeah.
And, you know, the studios were just, there was 5 or 6 rooms that were just remarkably mirrored outfits of the most pleasurable outboard combination you could ever imagine. Microphone collection was ridiculous. You know, you put it all together. The consoles, the maintenance, it was impeccable. Like, you know, that's something of the past, we all know, right? And it was really a big influencing factor for my brother and I, who were in the group. When we started Vintage King, you know, we didn't realize we were starting VK. We started collecting and buying and selling, probably like you did back in the day, to outfit your studio, because we were just in the infancy of outfitting our studio called White Room. So we were recording at your place, learning about all this gear. You probably don't remember me, but I used to pick your brain on, you know, you'd take me in the side room and show me your monitors that you built, hand-built, and how you did them and why they sounded so good. You'd show me your crazy mic collection, which was mind-blowing. And I learned a lot in 1990 from you about that. So it just all came back to me. So thanks for your...
oh, well, thanks again, Mike.
Thanks for the education. The outboard selection was insane, and you mirrored it in every room, was almost identical. What was the plan behind that?
You know, the premise, I was so lucky at that time, is that, you know, I started out buying out all these recording studios, and Bill Putnam was my partner in it. And we bought out, I don't know, probably 40 or 50, you know, complexes around the country. And every time I do it, I'd have a chance to cherry pick at Esoteric, and this Pultec DTP-183, and this Lang, and this one, and this. And so over a period of years, we built up a pretty staggering collection. So from my standpoint, I wanted every one of these items in every single room. Because, of course, I built the studios really more for me, because if I was an engineer, I walked in there, what would I want?
Right.
And the same thing's true with microphones. It's a question of going through, because I think I shipped in 1,000 mics from Europe over, you know, a 10-year period, and I'd go through and I'd pick the best 47s, the best C12s, the best M50s. And, you know, and then over a period of time, we had a pretty fun collection.
Wow, and it was fun. I remember just, you know, you'd work there, and anything you could imagine of the best you wanted, no problem. Alan and his crew brought it in, and it was remarkably maintained. And I think one of the biggest impressions also, you know, your tech staff, Bruce, Kurt Bujak, let's see,
the guy builds microphones.
David Bach.
Right.
So I learned from them. You know, I was like, what are the, you know, these ATR 124 Ampex 2-inch machines in every room, and there was, I think you had 9 or 12 of them.
Right.
And I remember them looking beaten up at the end of the day when they had to service them, because they were really hard to maintain machines.
It was a piece of work.
But the best sounding machine ever made, right?
Crazy.
Just,
I mean, they deliver plus 30 out with no transformer. They are, you know, they have super fast. They're basically slewing at like, you know, 50 pulses per microsecond. And the low end at 30 IPS was the best of any multi-track machine.
It's, you know, you'd record, you'd compare input to record. And it sounded the same. And, you know, you didn't lose any punch. You didn't lose any volume.
Right.
And it just was, it was remarkably the same. And if anything, a little bit punchier. And it just, but that always blew me away. So what happened is I had, you know, no funds back then, just starting a studio at the time, and I bought an HR 124 crazily when I got home from Ocean Way.
Good luck. And
I remember the tech bills were, you know, almost drives you into bankruptcy, but they sounded amazing, and, you know, and you guys had, like, you know, you'd have a 16-inch or 16-track head block, a 2-inch 24-track head block, and I had the same thing, having fun with that. And what kind of budgets were albums at that point?
Can I say no limits?
Right, so million plus, no problem.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I think when I think of Michael Jackson, and I think of Lionel Richie, and I think of Whitney Houston, all the folks, I think of the Stones. Yeah. On the 2 records they did with us, I mean, the budgets were just staggering. And of course, I mean, it's fun because they would try anything and they'd experiment. And at one time, we were the biggest buyer of 3M tape in the world.
When you recorded in one room versus the other with a different brand model console, like a 8078 in this room, the cream colored API, whichever one you had. Did you cut in that room for the sound of the console and stick to, so if you have a group, and let's say you're cutting a whole record, did you cut through all the mic pre's of the desk and just devote yourself to the sound of that console to create the tonality of the record to be around that sound, or did you always mix and match mic pre's from all the different brands and etc.? Like still so popular today,
The thing is that because a discrete A78 if everything is tits, and the same thing with the stock 1073s or the API, they're all really, really good. Those mic pre's, I'm not saying they're interchangeable because they all sound different, but they're good enough that they fit within my vernacular. So it becomes more an EQ thing where maybe I need my API original 550As on my left-right overheads because it does a certain thing that I can't get out of a 1073 and I can't get out of a 1081. So there's certain things that I go that are consistent from room to room. So if I have a couple of C12s over the drums, and I always think in terms of overheads as not cymbal mics, but an overall kick setup.
Okay.
And so if I go +4 12K shelf, two API 550As with those mics, it has a certain thing that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And if I go in like the 1073, and the 1073 is better because it's a 12.5 shelf, but it can get a little harsh if I start adding up. It's bringing too much of the 7 and 10K when I'm looking more for the air.
Yeah.
So I would go to different rooms, but like the 1073, like on a kick drum, for electric guitars and kick drums and bass, it's almost unbeatable. The 33 hertz bass boost is one of my favorite things. And like even on a kick drum, the shelf, the high frequency shelf, 12K shelf, adds an air that is pretty fab.
Yeah.
So you do get stuck in a rut where you maybe, okay, I'm in this room, but maybe I have a couple 1073s over here, and maybe I got a couple APIs over here.
So you'd use the console for the main color, but you'd throw in some little variety of color for specific duties.
Exactly.
For favorite things. Okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So and that's obviously really common, and I think it was just interesting to, back in the day, when studios, if before my time in the 70s or that, people didn't think like this, mix and match and all that. You used what was in front of you, the recording console. So not until...
And that was a fight, because if you were like on an MCI console, you had to use MCI EQ. I would wait till later.
Yeah.
Because once you put that on, you could never get it off.
It was imprinted, yeah.
Okay. Or like the early Trident series, TSM, whatever it was, it had kind of a gritty quality to it. When you turn up the boost, it made the cymbals kind of sound broken.
Sure.
And like you tried to that's something you didn't need on your recording.
Right. Now you can't take that away later.
Well, because in the analog domain, obviously we prefer to put our EQ on while recording because for his purposes, we want more resolution.
Yes.
And so I'd rather EQ while I'm recording, but obviously if I don't have that at my access, I'm going to deal with it afterwards.
You're really well known for your vocal sound. You have a remarkable vocal chain. What was the magic, man? What was behind it?
Well, there's that classic thing where you'd like to say there's one mic that's right for all, but there really isn't. Every singer is unique. Every singer is different. So if I had a singer and I'm listening to them sing in front of me, I may have a couple of mics in mind. So maybe I put up an M269 and a 251 and a U47, or if it's maybe a little too simple and I'm going a 67, a particularly good one. And then I had a prototype of the Sony C800G. George and I worked with Sony in the development of that microphone, and we had some prototypes that were particularly good. And I was very fond of that microphone. But it depended on the siblings. But of course, obviously with Pro Tools, the ability to manipulate every S separately allowed you to use sometimes a brighter microphone, then go in and finesse all the S's and T's afterward to make it sound perfect. Because that was the thing, for me, in regards to, say, speakers, if I can hear well, then everything I do is right. If I'm not hearing well, then I'm in trouble. So when I'm listening to a vocal, the fun part is that I go through, and if there's one word that's a little harsh, in one syllable, I can take the 5K out or 2K out, just that one word or half a word, make every S and T sound, and make a vocal sound smooth and really have attack and punch without being harsh. So then, because the fun is you want to be able to turn it up and have it kick ass and not hurt your ears.
Sure.
And that's really,
So you got into that kind of editing with Pro Tools in what year? When did you kind of...
Yeah, I mean, once Pro Tools came around, of course, early Pro Tools was still painful because manipulating stuff was a little bit more, it still took time, but at least you could do it. Yeah. I mean, in the early years, like I was doing an album with Joni Mitchell one time, we did it, and her vocal technique was all over the map. Sometimes she's eating the mic and sometimes not, and it's really, and so when I'm doing comps, as I'm doing comps, I would EQ every word and finesse it. I'd punch in word for word for word until I made it sound perfect.
Right.
And I'd also, so you put the mix up, you set the vocal where you want it, and then I go through from beginning to end until I make the vocal like it's completely written. And if it's underwater, I'd make it like an API 550 across. I'm doing plus 6 at a 5K shelf and -4 at 400 on the second half of one word
Yeah.
to get it to sound perfect.
Sure.
And
Right. That way, by the end of the time, you're like, this is a
You-
remarkably
sound-
well-sung track.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Sounds,
Wow.
I mean, because I remember when the H910 first came out, we were doing a Kenny Loggins record. I think it was "I'm All Right" or something like that. And he said, "Oh my God, we can actually pitch things." Oh my God, can you imagine trying to pitch a word with a 910, then punch it in, and you're trying to follow the thing down? It was a pain in the ass. It was ridiculous.
That's
of
where it
course,
started.
I mean, Kenny can sing. Why are we even wasting our time, Kenny?
Right.
You can sing this perfectly in tune. You don't need this.
She'd use an Eventide 910 harmonizer to repitch back in the day.
Oh my God, painful.
Yeah.
Or there were certain artists. We did one sort of a major artist. I better not say who it was, but and we did this record where it was kind of an R&B record. It's not really her thing. She's more of a Broadway singer, and so she just couldn't sing on the beats. So we reeled the entire vocal off the piece of quarter-inch tape and punched every word back in time, pre-Pro Tools. You can, if you're willing to finesse it.
But back then, you didn't know any. That's what you did, right?
You had to make it work.
You made it work. So those are great stories. What would you use for your chain? So that talking about mics and your editing. So what was your pre?
So if I
choice
pick a mic that I like, and the other thing too for the singer, for me, was really important is finding the exact position where that singer sounds perfect on that microphone. And so for me, it's setting the windscreen in just the right place, putting a little red dot. So I said, this is really where you want to be. You want to be on axis. That's the spot you want to hit. Because the most important thing is different mics have different levels of proximity. Some sound much better closer, some sound. So I find the spot for that particular singer, and that's a big part of it, And then also finding, a place. Part of the vocal thing isn't just the microphone, but it's the headphone mix. So a lot of times when I'm doing vocals, I've got the headphones on. I have the mix up on my phones, and it should sound like a finished record. I want the verb, I want everything to sound slick. So when they're singing, it's not a rough mix, it's a finished record.
Sure.
And what the performance they give you is so much better when they're hearing that way.
Absolutely.
And that obviously you want to make sure that there's intonation issues, depending on the singers, that you've got the right melodies that they can,
reference,
those sort of things. And then the other thing is, in regards to, say, compression, every singer is different. Some singers, I could not record without a compressor. But I tend to like the old DBX 160. Forgive me. It is a 318 amplifier, which is quite a fast amp, same amp as in the ATR 102. It's quite a good sounding unit, and if I need to do a lot of compression, it's quite fast. And so I have one singer, who is just like, I was compressing, peaks of 16 dB peak compression, but because she has so much presence in her voice, it sounded great, right? Other singers, I could do that, like Josh Groban, if I'm recording him, and he can get quite dynamic, the compressor destroys his voice. It ruins it.
Right. That compressor, if you don't hit it too hard, it's perfect, but when you hit it hard, it starts to eat the signal,
Well, so what I do now is a lot of times I'll record, like Josh, I'll have a plug-in just for monitoring purposes, but I record with no compression at all. Mm-hmm. So it's clean as a whistle. And sometimes I'll even record on 2 tracks. One is 8 dB louder. Mm-hmm. So in its low stuff, I'm at a higher resolution point digitally. And I'm going to bring that stuff up 8 dB anyway. So then what I do is I just switch, that track's in distortion, obviously, when so I'm basically on that track for the quiet stuff, on the other track for this, and then I go in and I manipulate every word separately. Because it doesn't take me that long. Maybe I'm going to spend 30 minutes on that vocal, maybe an hour, getting everything perfect with no compression. And for him, it makes a huge difference in how it sounds at a finished level.
So you had a great workflow with the various techniques you would use to have a great end result on your comping and so forth, combining all these.
Well, the other thing too is because I come from the hi-fi where I had to do direct-to-disc sometimes, or live to 2 tracks, where the whole thing is live. And I was doing a thing with Richard Page. It was a Tom Scott record where we had Jerry Hay and the horn muff, we had background singers, percussionists, all live 2-track. Obviously, the compressor's there, but then so is my rides. I'm doing a ton of rides.
Yep.
To keep it all, flowing where it needs to be.
Awesome.
It's, it requires
some
constant attention.
Years of experience, right?
Yeah, and then in regards to EQ, it's infinitely better, once again, if you get the mic position perfect and you get the right choice of microphones, then EQ is much less of an issue because you pick the mic that the tonality is right for that singer. It doesn't mean you might have to add a little high frequency shelving or whatever you have to do to get that singer perfect, but generally speaking, it's always better to get the right mic in the right position first and then look at EQ.
So Alan, let's talk about gain structure for all these singers. You talk about optimizing their position, the perfect spot to sing for proximity and so on. What about the gain structure?
Well, the classic thing is before the compressor's even the line, it's a matter of finding the singer, how loud are they going to sing, where is it going to be, what's their dynamic range, and you say, okay, look, this is where, okay, when they're kicking ass, this is what it is, okay? So obviously the most important thing is to find, if your mic pre, it's an API, and hopefully you can do it without a pad, and you find out, okay, I can cover anything the singer's going to do. And the thing you have to remember is that whatever they do while you're running it down isn't what they're going to do when they actually perform it. So allow another 12%.
Sure.
Because
a little more room for error.
This class, I was doing a duet with Linda Ronstadt. I was doing a film for Spielberg, and Linda Ronstadt and James Ingram were doing this duet somewhere out there. And when Linda hits the high notes, I had a 67 on her. The thing about Linda, she trained with Valgaray, and she didn't come off the mic. And when she sings loud, I can't even tell you. But the 67 broke up on the it wasn't the preamp, it was actually the mic.
The mic amp broke up.
Right, now, and I can't tell her to back off. She doesn't back off. But I hate putting the pad on the 67 because it degrades the sound.
Sure.
But with her, there simply was no choice because she was not willing to
pull back.
So I had to punch in the two, a complete take. So I had to punch in the two high notes to correct that.
Yeah.
I said, Linda, we have a slight problem here. So if you set your gain structure where you're clean as a whistle and you've got your monitor, say it's on a pot and you've got it zeroed here and you've got that just where you want it and you got that 12%, then I patch the compressor in and I look at where I'm going. And so the other thing too is that sometimes I'll say, okay, I need this much compression in the chorus of the bridge, but I would like to have more compression than that when it gets down to the verses, because the verses there's no compression because I've set it over here.
Right.
So sometimes I'll set the gain where the compressor is after this pot, so that actually I'll bring it down, compressors less, I'll bring it up, and so I get constant even compression from the quiet stuff and loud stuff.
Oh, that's awesome.
Obviously, like the API preamp, the discrete API preamp compared to the 1073, they're all just slightly different, but they're all really good.
Yes.
I mean, it's hard to go wrong there.
You could go on a desert island with any of them and record a great album, right?
I mean, you get esoteric like an original UA610 module. That's pretty juicy,
For sure.
Or the Mastering Lab tube preamp, that was pretty neat in its own respect. There are certain preamps. And even that Manley tube preamp, the older one they made, was pretty tasty.
Yeah.
It was a nice sounding pre.
I remember working in Ocean Way in one of the rooms back when I first met you, and a guy came in with a UA610, a raw one, and wanted to sell it. It was kind of floating around from the room. You want to buy this? And he'd plug it in. It sounded remarkable. No case, no, just pigtails hanging off it. High voltage tube free, but just all kinds of things floated around the studio back in the day.
Well, I had a 12 input one. Was the original one built for Hawaii Calls, and I remember I went over to Studio One and we were doing this string session with Johnny Mandel for a Kenny Loggins thing, and it says I brought that in, and all the mics went through my 610. Wow. Straight to the multi-tracks.
How did that sound?
It sounded amazing.
Pretty amazing.
Well, the 610, the EQ was +3, +6, +9.
Right.
But in the +3 mode, it was perfect because it had a bit of loss in the high frequency, but in the +3, you're probably it'd be like having +1 at a 15K shelf. By the time you put in, it was actually quite flat.
How would you characterize it? When you compare tube pre's like a V76, V76M, all those great German ones, to a UA610. Especially the V76M was very open. Right. And it was the biggest. It sounded like it had no filter on the low and top end like some of the other ones had. When you compare a UA610 to the Telefunken?
And obviously the later 610 didn't, not that it sounded bad, but it was different than the original one. And I would say that it sounds extremely open and airy. All things that we look for.
Right. And I always referenced, if it sounded, you'd walk out in the room and you hear people playing and singing. You want to hear the same thing when you walk in the room. No veil over it.
Too much to ask.
Compression. Right. Too much. Well, that's what those did. They just sounded.
They had that just incredibly open air space, and it's like lifelike. What can I say?
Pretty cool.
But there's the thing. I mean, as you as an engineer, if you walk up and you're sitting where you are, and I'm listening to what you sound like, that's my reference point.
Correct.
I mean, although sometimes we're looking to make it sound better than that.
Yep.
But bigger than life.
Start there.
Bigger life never hurts.
That's right. You can always pull back bigger than life, but you can't. It's harder to create later if you don't start with it. So.
But there are some singers. Like I remember there's a guy named John Hyde. Who John is. John's a great songwriter, and we were doing a record with Ray Cooder and Nick Lowe and stuff. It was called Little Village, and on a 251, he sounded like he had a +8 at 10K shelf. He just had, his voice sounded like a crazy thing. And so on an SM58, he sounded great. I mean, absolutely amazing on an SM58. So, there's a situation where what comes out of his mouth is so unusual that an accurate microphone isn't what you're looking for.
Right, because it would over accentuate that frequency.
So we're looking for impressionistic, looking for something that hits the spot that you might not normally, think in terms of.
Yep. So just mating the right mic with the singer, regardless of what model it is.
So the best mic in the world isn't necessarily the best mic for every singer. That's all.
So Alan, you've recorded, the amount of range of styles of music has been broad in your career, and I think just talking about recording drums for a minute, because I'm sure you've ambient, dead, in between, et cetera. Where do you start? Give us some of what's your key tips and tricks if you're walking into a session?
In the early era, of course, obviously, working with a band, and so I used to actually tune all the drums myself, pad them, adjust them, and do the whole thing myself. There's always that issue between keeping the drummer, I said, how can I finesse this without create a disturbance in the force? Because obviously the last thing I want to do is make the drummer feel uncomfortable. But in the same respect, I need to get the end result I need to get. So, and the other thing is I tend to spend a lot of my time either before the drummer walks in, if I can get everything together before they even enter the door. I was doing an album with Phil Collins in Switzerland, and we were in a castle, and so I had to set up a whole room to record the drums of Phil's drums. And Phil's just the greatest guy in the world, but he doesn't have much, he needs it to be slick and ready to go when it comes in. So finally, we had done some prep tracks. Phil's going to do his drum overdubs. So I spent a lot of time on the headphone mix, and when he walked in once again, I got in every sound of drums. It was ready to go. So he walked and he sat down, he put on the headphones, he played the takedown top to bottom. We did one punch, the song was done. He says, Alan.
And when you play to a great mix, a drummer, you might, a lot of times, drummers, I've often found that when they're not playing as hard, when they're playing a little bit medium volume, so to say, you get your best tones.
Yep.
So setting up the headphone mix is so critical to that.
Well, I was doing a session with Vinny Cavalier, right? Who's a good friend of mine. And I go back, Vinny and I, we met originally, he and Steve I were playing with Zappa. It's the first time we recorded.
Wow.
We go back that far. But anyway, he's doing the session with me. I can't remember what the session was, and Bobby Colombia's producing. And he finishes the track, he takes the headphones, he throws them on the ground, he says, fuck sides. He was so pissed. He says he's been used to having headphone mixes sound so bad for so long that when he put this on, he's hearing verbs, all this stuff. He was just like, God damn it, I forgot.
Right.
I forgot and because the joy of playing.
Right.
Because once again, doing that live 2-track stuff, what I would do on one of those big dates where you get all these players is, I have everybody in pre when they walk in, just so they've got a headphone mix. We do a take. And the second I had a good mix on the board, I flip them over to my mix. So they're hearing the finished record.
Cool.
And so they're playing, and it makes it 10 times easier for me to mix because they're adjusting to what they're hearing and everything is balanced.
And they're playing to if you're compressing, they're playing to the compression, they're playing to the reverb, and that's it. That's the point. It's like you play to the mix, and it creates a better track, as a result.
Well, I also got into with Keltner, he enjoyed the sound of compression as a side chain. So I used to like the Orange County. I made a custom version of an Orange County stereo compressor, which is similar to the ADR Complex. Sure. Even a little more interesting in certain respects. And so I would take a mult off the overheads and then a secondary mult off of the room mics, and I have that on separate tracks. Okay. And so all the attack is untouched, and I stick that in, and it gives you this roar of a floor, but with all of the punch is still intact. Because if I put a compressor across the whole mess, obviously I'm losing all the attacks. Yep. And so the fun factor goes away. Because I'm a punch freak. You can't make it punch enough for me. For me, I'm into expansion, not compression. But I love the roar of all the sustain.
The effect, yeah.
And so even if you recorded in, if you take a mult of the left-right overheads, it's amazing how roomy that can get when you have the, if I have them 50, say, for the rooms, it's actually sometimes too roomy. Where I can actually, in a room like Studio B, which is a relatively light room anyway, if you play just the overheads with no compression, it's fairly dry sounding. But you put the compression as a mult, put it underneath, all of a sudden it takes on a lot of color. Yes. And
right, so you would be multing back then and blending, and right, you had real good control later on then.
Exactly. Okay. Because even the same thing, when you're mixing overall, I tend never to use bus compressors because it's, if it's a song that's up-tempo from the beginning, doesn't really change much, you can get a threshold that works pretty good and it sounds okay. But unfortunately, if you get something that's dynamic with a big chorus and a bigger bridge, it just kind of turns to mush in the middle. Yep. And so if you can use mults and you have compression underneath, and then when I master, I'll do some peak limiting to get the level that I need on the thing. But it leaves me a little room to do something when I master, where otherwise it's completely down, squashed down to thing, and there's no fun factor.
Okay.
That's all.
And how do you? What's the simple basics on recording a kick and a snare?
Okay, typically on a kick, nothing too complex. I typically will have an inside and outside mic. I typically use a D112 inside, usually about 6 inches from the beater, aimed directly at the beater inside the drum. And then I'll typically use U47 fat with a windscreen on it. Always with a windscreen, because the air is just going to give you subsonics and stuff that has no relevance and damage the microphone. So I have that outside the microphone. And then usually, when I look at Pro Tools, I may make slight changes in regard to time between those two microphones, depending on what it is.
For phase, yeah.
But that's, and the other things, oftentimes also, I may take a mult off the D112 and a mult off the 47 FET, and I put it into a DBX 165, and I'll do a thwack sort of thing, where I basically set the attack super slow so that the leading edge comes through and then clamps down afterwards. And then I'll put that on a separate track, which is called a thwack track. And I can have one for each of the two microphones that I can tuck back in for impact if I choose to.
Okay.
Makes it super punchy. But of course, the problem is you need to do it while you're recording it, because once you're in the digital domain, if you try to go back digital and go back in again, you can never get it perfectly aligned. It's always slightly off, and there's always a certain amount of phase relationship.
Sure.
So if you're mixing, you can do it after factory mixing, but you can't go back in and back out again. That's all.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And when did you start? What year were you doing that technique?
I was doing Olivia Newton-John records with this guy John Farah, and he showed me this thing. And I said, "That's impressive." I mean, you pick things up along the way. He showed me that it's.
So back in the 70s, early 80s.
That was probably the early 80s.
Okay. And what about snare? So what's, trying to get the perfect fat back. Let's say you want the wallet kind of business card vibe snare. What's the trick?
There's a lot of different. It depends on the snare. I mean, let's play. If you're going to go simple, right? Let's face it.
Let's say I come in with a superphonic. I got a real nice snare, tune the ring's real nice, but I want to pull back a little bit.
Well, what I used to do, I mean, one mode of doing it is the top snare might be an original Silver Shure 545, not a 57, but a 545, which has a little bit more crispness to it. And so that's my top snare mic. It's on axis, just off the rim, pretty normal position. And then I use a pair of Sony C55Ps in stereo under the snare. Okay.
It's not too elaborate.
Oh no, which is super crunchy and as is crisp. It really sounds great.
Right.
But in an overall kit where you're looking for isolation between the hat and the thing, the 57 still works amazing well. Sometimes an original 451 with 20 dB pad and the right windscreen, I also like that. But it depends on the snare. If it's not a super punchy snare, it's not the best mic. If it's got great attack, the 451 works great. The 50 cent obviously adds a certain edge to it that we like.
Sure.
And so if there's that, and then there's the thwack, and in fact, sometimes years ago, I used to use Simmons SDS5 drum machine. Yeah. It's an analog synthesizer, but it made great white noise. Yeah. So I'd use a little bit of that white noise underneath,
blend it in.
That sounded really quite nice.
Cool.
And if it's done tastefully, you never know it's ever there.
Do you ever try setting snares in the room? I remember I learned this from Ron St. Germain in a album we did. He would just turn snares upside down with the rattle.
Absolutely.
So like you'd hit the snare and all those rattles in the room would take place, and it'd add high end without adding EQ.
Oh, with Cooter, we were doing a thing with Ry Cooter, and same thing, Keltner. And we did about 20 snares in the room upside down, and it was delicious.
Used to record the kick and snare on 2 tracks to.
Well, that's it, because of course, recording on analog tape, and I was a very fan of Scotch 250, which had the lowest self noise. And so to get perfect transits coming back, you want the kick and snare coming back with absolute punch. If you're listening to repro and you're just fooling with level, you're looking and you set it for +3, and you're looking and you say, at what level do I record it where it comes back perfectly? And if you want it to come back perfectly, I have to record it. If we set it for +3, it would probably be -2.5 to have it sound. You have the slightest bit of take compression, but it comes back with ultra punch. If I record it 0+1, it comes back like mush. So if I have 2 tracks, play them in mono, it cuts the noise in half. So it's like having a half track. It's like a half track, 2-track. So I was able to record at that level and get really quiet sound.
Wow.
So my kick and snare were on a 16-track, recorded 2 channels each, played back in mono. Obviously, as long as you're pan center, you pan left and right, then you get the noise. But as soon as they're pan mono, it cuts the noise in half.
Cancel. Okay. Or cut them in half.
Exactly.
Wow.
So I do the basics on 16 and then my overdubs on 24, either 1 or 2 24 tracks.
So Alan, how did you get started in this recording business, and what was the defining moment that got you into things?
For me, I'm a musician, I'm a bass player and a guitar player, but for me, it's always been the sound, the sonics, the musicality of it. And I designed and built speaker systems from the time I was 13. That's my thing. And I really got into the recording studio business not intentionally. I needed impressive sounding material to play on my speakers. It really came down to that because there were so few albums that sounded amazing. And my good friend Phil Ramone, he did certain things, certain albums that just sounded unbelievably great. And Phil and I became close friends later on, and just the finesse, the reverbs, the punch, all the clarity. And Phil said one thing about his stuff. He says every album he did, whenever he mastered it, it was always from the source tape, never from a copy. So when you bought the LP, it was right off the master tape. Okay. And that's a gargantuan difference. And so, but there were just, I don't know how many records that I could listen to, but there was 8 or 10 records that I thought sounded amazing, and most of it sounded bad. So my premise was, I started going out recording stuff, experimenting, doing live shows, and I had a pretty amazing mic collection because of my wheeling and dealing, even at that period of time. I had a bunch of Cine Church microphones, and I had U47s, and I had Shep CM61s, and I had C60s, and so I started making recordings that sounded great on my speakers, and I sold a lot of speakers, but people became very interested in the recordings. And so before you know it, Ocean Way, the garage, became quite a successful commercial studio. But I did not intend it to be. It kind of was a different direction.
That's a great story. I didn't know that.
That's how.
That leads to now present.
Yes.
With your current company and so on, and the speakers you're now offering. How did that all evolve?
Well, we've always done sort of custom systems for various clients, and so for like Dave Grohl, I built this for him, for T-Bone Burnett, we did accessions for Disney. I did Skywalker Ranch. We did these sort of installations, but they were more like one-offs, and I would do, probably 8 of them a year, which I love to do. It was fun. But we decided to get more serious about making things that were smaller physically, things that that would sound amazing at a more reasonable price, and that would satisfy me aesthetically. Because I'm kind of a snob. I am. I have to.
It's okay.
I am. And like your engineer, over at the 45.
Yes.
He's great.
Right.
He says, I'm a snob too.
Yeah.
Because it either is or isn't. I love to say there's in between, but to me it has to have superb imaging. It has to have wide dispersion. And the two sides, to make me happy, they need to be within 1 dB of each other, from say 20 gig to 400 hertz. And if it's that, then as a mixer, the fun part for me is that I don't want to think about the speakers. All I want to do is turn the knobs and make it sound good. And I want to play it in my car and be happy.
So then there's nothing wrong with aspiring for that. So you pay your level of attention to detail as a result is high.
Well, because the premise that we talked about before is that if I'm hearing well, then every decision I make is right. Yep. And so I almost say that your purchase of speaker is probably one of the most important things. Even if you have a simple setup at home, like a minimal little Pro Tools setup and a couple of good mic pre's, if I can hear well, then all of a sudden my product can be very impressive because I hear what's wrong and I make it right. Yep. And know that the decision I made is correct. Okay. And that's it. And so, and also because of my clientele, at Ocean Way it was always tough because one day it'd be 50 Cent and the next day would be Andre Previn, or it'd be Green Day or Radiohead, or it would be we're doing a classical gig with John Williams. It was such a variety of folks, and so one day it has to be a complete audiophile, and the next day Dr. Dre's in playing at levels that are off the scale of imagination. And so to satisfy this broadband clientele was very difficult.
So that was a baseline for your creation of the models that you now are offering.
And so people like Glenn Johns would come in and, he loved to mix in the big speakers. It was incredibly important to him that the big speakers be high res, accurate, fun to listen to. We're not looking for a hype. We're just looking for something that if I've made it sound great and the musicians come in for a playback, they're going to go, that's ridiculous. And then I'm happy. Yep. And even the littlest speaker now, it still is flat to 40 hertz. It's got some serious punch. It's got the air, and it has enough to give me gratification. Because I say we are in show business, and not that I want to hype once again, but if I have 6 people standing behind me and the band's walked in, I want to play it back and I want to say,
it's got to feel good.
Yeah. And once again, if I need to change miking, or I need to finesse this and to crank up the toms and the fill, or I need more background section, or whatever you need to do to make it exciting, I need to know that what I'm hearing is correct. Okay. So that's what it came down to. That's why I got into the speakers. And I've had a lot of fun.
So Alan, with you have a custom end of the line, a production end of the line. Talk to us what the intention is for each and some of the key models within.
Well, as you know, we did these very big systems. Obviously the system we built for Michael Jackson originally for Dre, that is we call our HR1, and each speaker is 9 feet high and 7 feet wide. So that's a pretty big speaker.
Yes.
And so we've done a number of custom installations, in Singapore and Hong Kong and China for audiophiles where there are no limits, shall we say. And of course, there's no limits to the price either. And we built some pretty amazing exotic systems. In the same respect, we did all these other high-end systems for all of our various, clients or artists work for us. So that's always been a part of our business, an important part of the business. But then, the premise was, can we create something like we have a system called the HR2, which is 120 degrees of perfect dispersion, but it's basically 5.5 feet high and it's 3 feet wide and it's it's a big speaker. So I said the physics of being able to take that and make it into something that's this big, it's quite a deal. And our chief technical consultant is a guy named Cliff Henderson, an MIT physicist. When I met him, he was chief of Altec Lansing, and I recorded his rock band. And he designed he really invented the constant activity horn, which became what we think of as line arrays. It's all based on his original premises.
Okay.
He's got more patents, but then he ended up doing all these big arena systems, which included the Staples Center, included the, I think it was the Omni Atlanta, and he did Madison Square Garden. And Dr. Bose bought his company, and he became the chief engineer of Bose, signed L1 for Bose.
Wow.
And so, he has joined our company full time. And so the physics of taking something that's this big and it delivers the performance and making it into a reasonable size, Cliff said, this is what we want to do. The physics of it's quite complex.
It's challenging, yes.
Because even in our littlest speaker, the question is, I wanted to go flat to 40 hertz. I wanted to go out to 25 kilohertz. I want you to be able to go 50 degrees off axis and sound exactly like it does to zero. And that just didn't exist. And so that was the premise for our HR 3.5, our HR 4S, our HR 4, and our newest, and even our smallest speakers. And so that's where we started. And the other thing, I wanted to make really a consumer speaker that would have this sort of dynamic range and fun factor, that would it would satisfy me aesthetically, both musically and acoustically, that I could bring them into a studio. I could set them on top of the meter, put them behind the console, and have the musicians walk in and got a tremendous amount of wow factor, but know that it was accurate. And that's where we started. That's where we ended up, I think. So it's been about 5 full years now of really working on all of our current products. And so we've introduced the 3.5 about, it's been 3 months ago, 4 months ago. And we think, and it's, comparable in size to say an ATC 150, but it goes way lower and it'll produce shocking dynamic range. And it's the same thing. The fun thing too is that if you are sitting at the mixing position and you had 6, 7 people behind you, they would hear exactly the same sounds you heard sitting in the sweet spot.
It's such a wide sweet spot.
Yeah, and that was the thing.
So it was intentional for you. That was a key goal of yours. You
It
talk
really
a lot
was.
about the listeners beyond yourself.
Right. Because, that's, I think too, it's that same thing also is when they come in for a playback, say you have a mix up, right? And they come in for the playback. You've listened to this, I don't know how many times. You're thinking, they come in for the playback and they listen to it. And while they're listening to it, all of a sudden you're hearing things you didn't hear because they're standing there.
Yep. It's kind of like when you write a song, you hear it differently in front of a different crowd the first time,
Or you're standing in the hallway and you're hearing, God, I missed the guitar line on the third verse. Jesus, what am I doing?
Yeah.
And so that is the joy for me. It was so important to be able to hear accurately, and so important for me to be comfortable to walk out. And it reached a point where I used to, in the old days, I would walk out, I put it in my car, and I'm driving home, and I'm calling in changes. I need the backgrounds here, plus 4 dB, plus 0.4 here. Give me this, give me the tom fill. I need, and I would do all those. I'm listening to all the rides in the car and have them put them in before I get home. I don't have to do that anymore. I can just basically relax and say, yeah, no, I think it's fine. Send it to mastering. Nothing I need to do. And also, most of the time when I send it to mastering, they don't do anything. Other than me looking at what level I want to be.
Yeah.
I says, it's that compromise between impact and level. And so other than that, generally, I almost use no EQ.
So what model do you favor for your mixes, so to say, if you're in a compact situation?
In a compact, I take the 4S's with me because they're, I usually set them up on stands just behind the console. So maybe they're about 6 inches behind the meter panel of the console. And the subs sit directly underneath them. It's really not a sub, it's a 3-way speaker. It just happens to be sub as a separate unit. And so the physical time alignment of all 3 items arrive to you exactly the same time. And I can move enough air that they really sound like mixed speakers. And so they're easy I can put in my car if I had to. And so I work at a lot of other studios besides my own. And so that turned to be just the right size where it wasn't too big that I couldn't move it. And our newest loudspeakers, what's in that, is going to be filled with gap. of something which is just one small box
Okay.
that would allow you to have that sort of bandwidth, you know, at a very reasonable price.
So Alan, where do you see the recording marketplace going in the next 10 years? You can see the transition happening, you know. Where do you see the workflow, analog versus digital, recording consoles versus in the box, et
I
cetera?
think because in the box, the premise, like when we did the Ocean Way drums, the premise there was to have something that sounded like a finished record. You call up a kit, and it doesn't sound like work in progress, it sounds like a finished record. And so that was the premise, is that kind of thing for a guy who's sitting in his house to have the access to, and like when we did the Universal Audio Ocean Way plugin, it really does capture the sound of those rooms. Because, you know, we did 3 sets of 8 stereo pairs of microphones within the space. And so, you know, you have something you record at your house, and it's fairly dead, but it's good recording. You pop it in there and you play it back, and you bring up the M50s, and you have a whole mixer and all these mics. It really sounds like you're in the goddamn room.
Yeah.
And so having that as an access, and you're sitting in your little, you know, 8x12 cubicle with your little speakers there, and all of a sudden stuff has air and space and things like that. So I think providing accoutrements that help folks who are sitting in their house make, you know, exceptional product is a big thing, because obviously a lot of stuff's coming out, they're limited to what they can do. And so anything we can do to expand that envelope, I think makes a big difference. And
It's a trade-off, because you lose the art of creating it versus, you know.
And like the studios like Ocean Way in Hollywood and Ocean Way in Nashville are still busy studios and functional studios, but obviously they're not essentially profitable by comparison to what we were doing in the days of obviously Michael Jackson.
When budgets were unlimited.
Yeah, they're not going to be that. It's not going to be that. But, you know, I mean, Eric Clapton will come in and he'll book, you know, a month or 2 to work, when Michael Jackson would book 3 years.
Sure. 3 years.
You know, or Green Day would be in for a year, or whoever it is, or even Radiohead would be in for, you know, 4 or 5 months. And so, you know, that's changed, but it's great that these places are still there because they're the last of that thing. Well, thank you, Mike, so much. I appreciate it. A pleasure.
Oh, man, we could talk for hours, but I really appreciate stopping by and sharing some stories with us.
All right. Well, I look forward to it.
Oh, good. Great luck with the new line or the new models within the line and so on. And we really appreciate you working with us.
Well, thank you.